Sound check. All right. Good morning. My name is Steve Maher, and welcome to our continuing outreach program and series on safety environmental management systems for offshore facilities. This is part of our continuing outreach program, an outreach of our engineering consulting business that focuses on process safety management, risk management programs, and safety and environmental management systems for offshore facilities. RMP and PSM being for onshore. Today we're going to be focusing on a very important topic, and that's operating procedures and how to sensibly create them, maintain them, and make sure that they meet the needs for maintaining the degree of safety that you want at your offshore facility. It'll be myself and also Carlos Cheek, which will be the main speakers. But before we get started, I need to discuss a couple of logistics items. Because this is a live webinar that provides the opportunity for interaction, you'll get a chance to have a discussion with your peers if desired, or to pose questions directly to the presenters afterwards. Because the interface we're using, we do have to keep the participants on mute during the course of the presentation. That way, activities at your office aren't going to disturb other participants' abilities to listen to the speakers and get something from the webinar. If you do have technical troubles, please just call the number at the bottom of the screen, 877-532-0806. That's 877-532-0806, and somebody will be happy to help you out if you're having technical challenges. Also, our producer, Solveig Sather, is at the other end of the chat window that you saw on your screen, and if you have questions that you'd like to present to the speakers or issues that come up, please feel free to pose them in the chat window. What's that? Oh, the user ID is Nicolo Tromba. Okay, the user ID is Nicolo Tromba, even though Solveig Sather is our producer. That's something we can probably improve on, and I'd like to do that at some point. Oh, another logistical item too. In the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you will see a video. That's an image of the speaker. If you'd like to expand or contract that window, you'll just use your mouse keys and do that as you would any window on your computer. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. These are the key topics we want to talk about today. I want to talk about regulatory driving forces, parallels between onshore and offshore developments in these regulations, comparing safety environmental management systems to other safety management systems such as PSM and RMP, and there's some really good news there in terms of resources that you might have available in your company. Are we having a technical problem? Yes. We're okay. So hopefully you're seeing a slide that says key topics on your screen, and we've got a spotter going too, right? Oh, okay, gotcha. All right, great. So at that point, I'd like to turn over to Carlos, and he'll talk about operating procedures, regulatory requirements, lessons learned from the Deepwater Horizon accident, development tips for developing your operating procedures, and also how to organize an effective SEMS program at your facility. We'd like to close with some background information on references and resources, things that you can get your hands on that can kind of help you pull your SEMS program together. And at the very end, we'll open it up to either interactive questions or you can post questions on your chat window. Okay, so what I'd like to do is really get started with why we're here. There's a lot of regulatory requirements that have been driven by major accidents that have occurred in the past. The good and bad parts about our modern standard of living is the fact that we have a lot of good standards compared to our ancestors, but with that technology comes a lot of potential hazards that it's up to the people who are part of the health, safety, environmental programs to manage those safety issues and make sure that we've got an ability to control that and minimize potential hazards to the community, to the environment, and also to operations personnel. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the history in terms of major accidents that have driven these regulatory requirements. The items in red are things that have really been pivotal events towards the development and movement towards safety management systems. In 1984, the Mexico City and Bhopal accidents back-to-back really woke up the world to the need for looking beyond just specific codes and standards associated with specific actions, but moving more toward performance-based standards. The Piper Alpha tragedy in 1988 was a wake-up call for the offshore industry, and it brought up many hazards and potential issues that needed to be addressed with respect to how you manage safety at offshore facilities, and also a lot of design issues too. The 2005 Texas City accident also brought up a lot of issues with respect to facility siting, and the main thing that's driving why we're here is the Gulf of Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico, the Deepwater Horizon accident on April 20th, 2010. 2010 actually started with a very positive outlook for offshore facilities and oil production in the Gulf of Mexico, and there was a real big push towards expansion in early 2010. 2010, as it unfolded, and after the Deepwater Horizon accident, brought a lot of attention to offshore facility safety, and it accumulated in October 15th with the putting out regulatory requirements for safety and environmental management systems. These requirements were effective, started on November 15th, 2010, and are due for implementation on November 15th, 2011. So 2010 saw a big change in people's perspectives on offshore facility safety. So what I'd like to do is look at some of these parallelisms between these various safety programs out there. Again, we're working towards effective tips for operating procedure, implementation, and development, and also effective tips for all for implementation of SEMS program, for the entire SEMS program. One of the pivotal events, as I mentioned, that was a wake-up call for all of industry with respect to the potential hazards associated with highly hazardous facilities, is the methyl isocyanate release from the Bhopal India accident. There were procedural errors, there was equipment that was turned off, key systems that were disabled, and it eventually resulted in 40 tons of methyl isocyanate being released into the community, and a number of lives immediately lost, and also a number of permanent injuries, and there's still a lot of after effects from that. For the offshore facilities, the Piper Alpha tragedy in 1988, there were some issues with respect to work permit system not operating, maintenance activities, equipment being left unblinded, starting up equipment, and eventually resulting in a significant vapor release, finding an ignition source, a significant fire and explosion, and the loss of 167 lives. When you're looking at the Bhopal tragedy, all those events that I shared with you on the previous slide, it was clear that accidents could cause a major loss of life and property. Typical characteristics of major accidents are they had relatively simple precursors. It wasn't a lack of knowledge or a lack of technology. And the root causes in all cases were failure to maintain the design intent. Somewhere along the line, what was engineered and what was designed somehow wasn't maintained or managed to the extent that the engineering and designing anticipated. So it was really more of a management issue. So it was really looking back at it as the most effective mechanism for improvement was not by looking at specific actions, which was how regulations were based at before then, but really by affecting changes in the way business is done. Basically, safety culture and management systems. And that's the heart of all these different programs that we're looking at. If you look at the timeline, it's really interesting to me. We did a nice poster session and a couple of papers at the Global Congress on Process Safety in Chicago in March. And it was really interesting putting the paper together. And by the way, if anybody would like a paper on the background of the SEMS program regulations and all these different developments, go ahead and send a note to the producer, Solveig Sather, who's going under the ID of Nicolo Tromba, and we'll be glad to get one to you. But when you look at the timeline for all these, Bhopal was a real wake-up call for all industry, but it really was something that land-based facilities really jumped on more than anything else. Industry addressed it first, forming the Center for Chemical Process Safety, which came up with technical management guidelines in 1987. And I'll come back to that a little bit later because that was a real interesting digestion of the kind of management issues that were out there and encapsulating them in a form where industry could use them to develop management systems that could control potentially significant accidents. The API also acted and came up with Recommended Practice 750, And it wasn't until after the industry standards came out that the regulators felt that standardization and evening that out between the many different industries and also the different companies was important. And so they came up with process safety management in '92 and risk management programs in '96. I actually had the privilege of being very heavily involved in the '80s and also being on the technical steering committee of the Center for Chemical Process Safety in the mid '80s. And this was a real significant change in the way people looked at hazards at facilities and how accidents occurred and how to control those accidents. In the offshore arena, actually, let's look at the bottom one first. For outside the United States, Piper Alpha had occurred off the United Kingdom, and as a follow-up to that, remember that occurred in 1988. The safety cases were enacted in the United Kingdom, and that was something that was adopted in many other places in the world, but pretty much in the United States. And I think a lot of that is because the accident, Piper Alpha accident, did occur in UK waters. Basically, the United States really didn't come up with very strong regulatory requirements until much later, and the Deepwater Horizon accident really brought people's attention to it. In U.S. waters, there was a lot of development and safety issues, and there was application. The American Petroleum Institute came up with recommended practice 75 for safety and environmental management programs, but those were voluntary guidelines that could be enacted as needed or as desired by the facility operators. The API recommended practice 75 had been updated several times. There were proposed regulations for safety and environmental management systems, but it really wasn't until the Deepwater Horizon accident occurred in U.S. waters that really got the U.S. regulatory arena involved and pushing for regulatory requirements that eventually became part of the 30 CFR Part 250. So you've got this bag of regulatory requirements. Well, you've got industry guidelines from the American Petroleum Institute, Center for Chemical Process Safety. You got regulatory requirements for onshore facilities, process safety management and risk management programs. In the offshore arena, as you remember, the Piper Alpha accident really pushed for the enaction of safety case requirements for UK facilities and also applied to other offshore facilities throughout the world. But you have this range of offshore regulations and guidelines from the fairly straightforward management systems concepts of SEMS and SEMP to the more complex safety case requirements that include those same management systems requirements, as well as more specific requirements for risk assessment and also quantification. So what I'd like to do, now that we've looked at the history, where these regulations are coming from, so you can see the big picture, is really compare safety and environmental management systems to other safety management system requirements. The key SEMS elements, these again are right out of 30 CFR Part 250, are general provisions, safety and environmental information, which is a key requirement or key necessity for being able to understand safety issues at a facility. And are you okay? Okay. All right, go ahead and we'll get you fixed later. Safety environmental information is a key foundation for being able to evaluate safety at a facility. In terms of that safety evaluation, you got hazards analysis that involves things like HAZOP studies and also job safety assessments, management of change issues to control if changes are made at the facility, operating procedures, which will be the focus today, safe work practices, training, mechanical integrity for maintaining the function of key equipment, pre-startup reviews, emergency response and control, incident investigation, SEMS and SEMP element auditing, and also controlling records and documentation. All these different elements are key parts of the SEMS program. And as for those of you who've been tuning into our SEMS webinar series, we've been going through each of these items one by one to identify. Are you guys okay with it? Okay, okay. We've been going through each of these items one by one to provide you with tips on how to implement them effectively. One of the key points again is this overlap between the programs. These key SEMS elements, for those of you who are familiar with these other safety management systems, they look very, very familiar. because the core parts of those are the safety environmental information, hazards analysis, incident investigation, mechanical integrity management change. All these are key parts of any safety management system. And the interesting thing to me is if you look back at 1987 with the technical management guidelines that came out of the CCPS, those guidelines and the key elements there are not all that dissimilar from programs that we've got in place now for onshore facilities, PSM and RMP, and also for offshore facilities for the SIMS and SEM programs. When you've got all these safety professionals looking at this for many years, and you've got the same core elements that keep coming up and are recognized as core contributors and root causes of key accidents or major accidents that have occurred at facilities ranging from simple refrigeration systems that deal with anhydrous ammonia to more complex refinery systems to offshore facilities. Whether you're onshore or offshore, whether your system's simple or complex, these same safety management systems concepts are pivotal towards controlling accidents at your plant site. And it's that overlap that'll provide you at your facility with a lot of additional resources in perhaps other business arms, and we'll talk more about that shortly. In the previous slide too, several of those elements were identified in red. Those elements in red are the ones that are considered not only more important and key towards controlling safety at your facility, but also are things that have been key focus points for audits and things that have occurred at various facilities and key regulatory findings. So those are the things, if nothing else, that you really need to focus on. And again, you've got a lot of commonality between these various programs. So when you're going about pulling a SEMS program together, you've really got a lot of resources at your fingertips. And for everybody's benefit, I've put together a reference table. If you're trying to communicate with other folks in your business units that other folks in your business units that are dealing with these other programs, you can go ahead and communicate them, and they've got separate regulatory citations. And the last webinar that we did on comparing and contrasting key differences between these programs, we showed what those differences are, but those differences are relatively minor. There's more in common than not. Okay, so at this point, now that you understand the big picture, how all these programs fit together, and a lot of the key elements, I'd like to turn this over to Carlos Cheek, who's going to focus on operating procedures.
All right. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Steve. I'm going to be focusing this morning on operating procedures. And I'm going to start with basically just out of the regs. So we're going to get to the basics. What does 250 CFR say, and what does API 75 have to say about operating procedures? And then I'm going to go into some details, show you some kind of piecemeal examples, some things that I just kind of drew up for this presentation, and then we'll go into organization and some things like that. So basically, right out of the regs, you need to have operating procedures for initial startup, normal operations, temporary operations. Temporary operations are the ones that people tend to struggle with. What is a temporary operation? What needs an operating procedure? And we'll also talk about JSAs and how to work with JSAs and your operating procedures and kind of how to get those working together. Emergency shutdown is obviously a very important one, and that needs to be very detailed. We'll talk about some examples with that when we get into Deepwater Horizon as well. Obviously, normal shutdown and then startup following a turnaround or following an emergency shutdown may be slightly different. There may be some extra things that need to be taken care of there, maybe some things that should be done just to kind of make sure things are wrapped up correctly. These are some of the requirements straight out of the regs that need to be included in your operating procedures, and these are all good ideas, and I don't see any reason why these shouldn't be on operating procedures, and the examples I show later kind of show how to include these into your operating procedures. Safety environmental consequences of deviation. So what happens when something isn't quite right? When you're doing an operation, something's kind of funny. Now as an operator, what's my next step? What do I do? That should be right there on the operating procedures, and obviously they need to be available and things like that. So the operators can take that correct action to hopefully mitigate any potential consequences. And the steps required to take that corrective action, obviously. You need to also have the necessary PPE. When I'm doing this job, I need to be able to have, what do I need to wear? What is required of me as an operator to protect myself against any potential splashes or anything like that, or even, perhaps some respiratory requirements. Control measures, and also it's something unique to the STEMS program is disposal of materials. So once I'm done with this, once I've done this maintenance task, I have these materials now. What do I do with them? On platforms, it's very important materials go to the right location, things like that. You can't just be putting things anywhere. And also, it's important operating procedures need to be reviewed on a specific periodic basis. It's in the regulations. They don't specify exactly what the period is, but in your own procedures, in your facilities procedures, it needs to be specified at what period you're going to be looking at your operating procedures. Onshore, it's 3 years is the requirement, or I'm sorry, it's annually, and at least to pull them out, take a look at them, review them, make sure everything's going on still accurately there. Some of the responsibilities that you need to make sure. Ensure all employees and contractors, depending on who's doing the task, are trained on those operating procedures. I'm going to emphasize the contractors portion because that's something that people tend to struggle on, is tasks that are done by only contractors. Those tasks need to have operating procedures as well. Your facility needs to have operating procedures for the tasks that are only done by your contractors. It's part of, you need to have checks and balances on your contractors to make sure they're doing the appropriate, or making sure they're doing the job correctly. You also need to have proof of training. So you need to have, a document saying this operator was trained on this operating procedure on this day. It needs to be kind of laid out in some sort of certificate and whatnot. That can be, electronic and whatnot, but there needs to be some sort of direct proof that that operator doing that task has been trained on it. Obviously, update your operating procedures if there's any major change that changes the accuracy of that operating procedure. If there's new equipment, new operating ranges, all those things that are on the operating procedure need to be kept up to date. Making sure the operating procedures are easily available to the employees. They shouldn't have to go digging through a giant binder to find their operating procedures. I've seen a lot of places, they laminate them, they make them, maybe 2 to 4 pages front and back, and they're able to laminate them, hang them up kind of right in there in that station. Obviously, maintenance procedures, they can be easily accessible to the maintenance personnel in their general area. I usually have a binder for those guys, things like that. But there needs to be some method to make sure those operating procedures can be accessed by the operators. And also need to certify the operating procedures for accuracy. You need to have someone needs to be designated responsible. This is the person that will make sure our operating procedures are correct. Give someone a definite task. Don't just let it hang and make sure, we're going to all look at them together. You need to have someone designated for that task to make sure that that gets done. Just some common deficiencies. I just kind of put this rough list together real quick. We'll also kind of highlight these as we go through some examples in the Deepwater Horizon in a second. I just want to kind of put them all together in a quick summary. Operating procedures not current for all of the normal operations. All operations need an operating procedure. Again, there's tended to be some disparity on which operations actually need an operating procedure, or which ones just need a JSA. There's some discussion about that. But according to the regulations, all normal operations, or any operation that you're going to have to do, should have an operating procedure. Usually the written procedures are somewhat out of date, or they don't represent exactly what the operators do out there. the operating procedures can be sort of general, where when you go out to the operators, they actually know, oh, this is exactly how you do this, but the operating procedures don't actually say that. If there's a certain order of things, that should all be captured on the operating procedures. Each phase of the operation isn't listed. Emergency shutdown procedures should have clear job requirements. Person A is responsible for this task. Person B is responsible for this task. So that way, in an emergency, it's exactly known who needs to be doing what, in what order. Again, temporary operations, they're generally not included. There's a general feeling that, oh, we just do a JSA for that. Well, if you know you're going to be doing it every time, maybe you should have an operating procedure for it to accompany it. And then again, contractors' tasks are not included in the operating procedures, and they do need to be. All your contractors' tasks need to have operating procedures. And we'll have some examples to highlight each one of these. So now I'm going to go into some of the examples or some of the lessons learned from Deepwater Horizon. And first I want to say we're not here to speculate or make any sort of judgment on the accident investigation. These are all direct quotes from the BP accident investigation, Deepwater Horizon. It was 8 September 2010 this was released. We're simply taking that information they gave us and we're trying to learn something from it. So we're not going to comment on how valid it is and things like that. So the first example I pulled, again, this is a quote straight from their accident investigation. The BP Macondo well team was provided broad operational guidelines for the negative pressure test. The rig crew and well site leader were expected to know how to perform the test. The guidelines for the negative pressure test, a critical activity, did not provide detailed steps and did not specify expected bleed volumes for success failure criteria. Therefore, effective performance of the test placed a higher reliance on the competency of leadership, competency and leadership skills of the BP and Transocean rig leaders. I was going to give some quick background if you're not exactly sure what a negative pressure test is. A negative pressure test, essentially, when you drill down to a well, you have pressure coming up from the well trying to get out, and you have all these things pushing down on the well, keeping the hydrocarbons and things down in the well. And the negative pressure test, and part of those things pushing down are your mechanical barriers that you have, cement, essentially, and then you have your mud, which is heavier than seawater. So those two are the basic things pushing down to keep the hydrocarbons down. The negative pressure test removes some of that mud and replaces it with seawater. Seawater is lighter than the mud, so it removes some of the pressure on the top so you can test your mechanical barriers to see if they're keeping the hydrocarbons down. So if you remove some of that pressure up and you don't see any flow, that means your mechanical things are in place and things are working. If you read the accident investigation, they weren't up top. They removed the seawater. They put the seawater in place. They saw some flow, but they weren't sure. It's like, well, okay, so we saw this happen. Now what do we do? We're not exactly sure if that's good or if that's bad. They kind of thought about it and talked about it and did something else, but it should have been pretty clear, or at least according to the accident investigation, that was a sign that something was not quite right, and they should have done some other actions than were actually done. So what we can take from this essentially is that detailed procedures are very important. Pictures of exactly what to do, where to do it, individual steps. Push this button to turn this on. Unlock this. Very, very detailed steps, step-by-step directions, and as well as pictures showing you exactly where that thing is and how it should be done can alleviate any confusion and whatnot. Also, ranges to expect. It's sometimes you struggle with ranges. People tend to think you're trying to bottle them in, or, oh, you know, this is just experience. You just kind of have to know what it is, or you just listen for it. Those are all the things you hear when you start to develop these operating procedures with, you know, very seasoned, very well-trained operators that have been doing this for, you know, 20, 30 years, and they know exactly how the procedure should be done. They know how it feels, you know, how it should work. But in the end, there's always a range that you can put down on paper to say, hey, this is where you know you're good. This is where you know something's a little bit off. Maybe we should think about it. And this is where you know you're bad. There's, even in the most, you know, feely, touchy operations, you know, there's a place where you say, hey, you know, something's wrong here. We need to take some serious action, and we need to take it now. And those ranges of what that is should be and can be on your operating procedures. In very plain English, hey, if it's more than this, shut it down, type things. And those can really help take away any question marks that an operator has. And also, this can work side in hand with your safe chart. This is an API 14C safe chart, or example of one. And a lot of that information is already on your safe chart. It just, you know, safe chart's a little bit cumbersome sometimes. They're not easy to read. You can take that information and transplant it onto an operating procedure, so an operator can use it very easily. And it's readily accessible. Red is good, green's bad. That's, you know, they can understand that. Also, the consequences of deviation. It's important to have these details listed out. If this happens, if you don't have this, you know, your consequences, you could have potential fire, you could have potential uncontrolled well, you know, all these things that could happen, whatever that thing is. And now, you know, what are your steps to correct that deviation? You know, 1, verify, 2, do this, so on and so forth. But it needs to be very clear, hey, if you don't have X signal, or you have pressure higher than this, you could have potentially fire, explosion, personal injury, equipment damage, whatever it is. Here's the steps you need to take to do it, to fix it. And this is all things that can be trained on ahead of time. As long as it's written down, it's easier to get them trained on it. And then also, these can be easily accessible for them. The next example the investigation team's analysis of fluid volumes shows an approximate gain of 39 barrels by 2108 hours. No well control actions were taken at that time, indicating that this fluid gain was not detected. Simultaneous end-of-well activities were occurring and may have distracted the rig crew and mud loggers from monitoring the well. The rig crew and mud loggers either did not observe or did not recognize indications of flow until after hydrocarbons entered the riser. The Transocean Well Control Handbook stated that the well was to be monitored at all times. However, the policy did not specify how to monitor the well during inflow testing, cleanup, and other end-of-well activities. So essentially, they're not sure if they either didn't recognize the signs of flow, or they just simply weren't able to monitor the well because they were busy doing other things. So they're not exactly sure. And one way to alleviate that is, in your operating procedures, detail out specifically who's in charge of what tasks to make sure they know exactly what they're doing. This is also something where operations and management need to work together. It simply could be a manpower issue. Hey, it takes 3 guys to do this task. That doesn't leave anyone left to monitor the station. Well, management needs to take action there. And those types of things can be found out in your operating procedures. If you write down the 3 guys that need to be doing it, well, you know, now is who's the guy that needs to be monitoring the station. So those sorts of things need to be outlined in detail on your operating procedures. This is just one example of a way to do it. You know, who's the service manager, who's responsible, authorized personnel, training required. All those things can be right there on your operating procedure, right at the top. When well influx occurs, rapid response is critical. The rig crews need effective procedures and must effectively implement them to maintain control over deteriorating conditions in the well. Transocean's shut-in protocols did not fully address how to respond in high-flow emergency situations after well control has been lost. This is a picture of the mud gas separator. This is what they transferred the high flow to. They transferred high flow to the mud gas separator when the mud gas separator is actually only for low flow conditions, so that their emergency procedures could have been better written so they took better action. So detailed emergency procedures are very important. You need to detail exactly what conditions procedure is valid. You know, they took, the operations apparently took the correct emergency action procedures that they were trained in. However, those emergency procedures weren't valid in this situation. In the high flow situation, they needed a different operating procedure, and apparently there wasn't one for them. So you need to take a look at your system. You know, what things do we have? What things can go wrong? So what other emergency operations could we be faced with? And are we covered by our current operating procedures? Are our emergency operating procedures detailed enough? Do we know exactly who's going to do what in an emergency situation? These are all questions that need to be asked to figure out exactly if you know what's going on and who's doing what in an emergency situation. Because things do need to happen fast once things get going. Transocean documents that were available to the investigation team did not specify a procedure containing detailed steps or minimum expectations for conducting a negative pressure test. Testimony from the Transocean Offshore Installation Manager to the Marine Board investigation on May 27, 2010, explained his policy to conduct a negative pressure test before displacing seawater. However, the question of written procedures was not addressed during that testimony. Essentially, what it comes down to is they're not sure if Transocean had a written procedure for how to do this negative pressure test. So essentially, this goes back to the point that I was trying to make before. Operations performed by contractors must have a written procedure. If it's a task only done by contractors at your facility, you should have a written procedure on file to ensure that that procedure is being done correctly. And they need to be trained on it, and they need to be signed off on that procedure. When they're on your site, you need to just treat them as if they are your personnel and make sure they're trained correctly. They have operating procedures, PPE, all those things. And that was one thing that, there was a little bit of miscommunication apparently between contractors and the facility itself. So that's one thing that could be alleviated. And the contractors one is tough, typically, because you're usually hiring a contractor because that's something that either you don't have the necessary skills to do on site, or you don't have the manpower to do it, or whatever it is. You don't necessarily want to deal with it. You just want to hire the contractor, have them get the job done, and take care of it. But it's important to make sure that you get those operating procedures. One option potentially is make it part of their job task to give you that operating procedure before they start. They're gonna fix the crane or do something with this and this. Well, we need an operating procedure for our files that they can write up, you can have on site, so that they can get their job done. And make sure they get that to you before they start. Or obviously get someone out there, one of your guys, walk it down with them, write up an operating procedure before you start. There's lots of different ways to fix that problem, but it's something that needs to get taken care of, and it's important, and it is a tough one. The investigation team has found no evidence that the rig crew or well site leaders consulted anyone outside their team about the pressure abnormality. Per the Transocean Well Control Handbook, Section 1, Subsection 2, the rig crew was required to consult the Transocean manager. This consultation was intended to verify that the manager was satisfied that the integrity of the barriers involved had been suitably tested. However, the handbook did not clearly define who the manager was. So once again, it's just an example of detailed operating procedures. Who is responsible for that consultation should be listed out very clearly. Hey, you need to talk to one of these guys. Also, potentially for, serious things like that, especially before some sort of startup or whatnot, maybe some sort of sign-off, some sort of pre-startup safety review could be in place to make sure that that consultation, hey, quick 2 minutes, take a look at this, what do you think of this, sign here, keep moving on type thing could be in place for things like that, especially for high priority, tasks such as this. That could be something that could potentially improve the safety of this whole system. Operating procedures. Now I'm going to detail a little bit about a way to organize your operating procedures. And typically, we have things, everything from, giant piles of it and drawers and whatnot to, a folder on someone's computer that has all sorts of Word docs in it and things like that. These aren't too efficient, and then they can get cumbersome and get, aren't really taken care of, things like that. So I'm going to show you one example of a way to organize your operating procedures, and I'm going to switch it over right now. So this is just one example of a program that can be used to organize things for your SIMS program. This program is called SEM Solution. This is a web-based program, which is one thing that we see as an asset for you. Being web-based, you can access the information from essentially any terminal that has internet, and that means both onshore and offshore can communicate. There's different ways to do that, but the point is, the most important thing is that things that are on the platform can also be seen offshore at the main offices and things like that, so they can provide oversight for what's going on the platform. This particular SEM solution is integrated to include all of the safety and environmental information, audits, compliance audits, things like that. It's all sort of integrated in here, and you'll see a little bit of that in a second. We are going to go, here we go, to our standard operating procedures. And the first thing that comes up for standard operating procedures is simple system-wide operating procedures that can apply to any portion of the operation. Just general operating procedures. One important thing that we like about this program is that you can see if these operating procedures have been reviewed. Who's reviewed these and when was the last time they were reviewed. Obviously, these haven't been reviewed because this is an example, but the idea is if these are reviewed, they would show who reviewed them right here. Also, you'll see here on the left, this is our equipment list. This is essentially our safety and environmental information built in to our operating procedures. So these are all of our equipment that we've entered in. So, for example, our compressors. These are now some of our compressors that we have on site, and we have, for this compressor, standard operating procedures, we have our normal shutdown. This was revised 10/7/2010. So this operating procedure is connected to our compressors. So you're seeing integration of operating procedures with our safety and environmental information as well. So again, these are specific deck vapor recovery compressors, and we have our operating procedures right here. So now the way you would implement this, if you want to add another procedure for our deck vapor recovery compressors, you simply add it here. And we have an online procedure builder that you can use to kind of step-by-step build a procedure, or you can simply upload a Word document from your computer. You know, pretty simple, pretty straightforward if you already have those procedures in place. And that's what we've done here. This test compressor SOP was simply uploaded. It's a simple Word doc that, that you can then have connected to that piece of equipment. And you can see when it was revised as well. So in here, you get lots of things on how to certify them, when to certify them, and scheduling as well. If you go back to the home page, you can put together a plan for when you want to have all your operating procedures certified by. So right now there's a lot of people that have lots of operating procedures kind of standing around. So how are we going to get all these things certified? And we can kind of put together a plan to get all that stuff done in a certain amount of time. So this is one way of how to organize your operating procedures. And there's lots of different programs that can do this type of thing. And I just wanted to sort of outline quickly the possibilities that you have and some of the key components that we like to see. Things like that show you when it's been revised, being able to upload and Word docs, and also being able to see this from many different terminals so you can oversight and see who's doing what at any given time. So we're going to switch back over to our presentation. Let me know when we're good. All right. So I wanted to touch briefly on job safety analysis because every time you talk about operating procedures, job safety analysis kind of gets into the mix a little bit. The main thing that we see is that there's, which tasks need an operating procedure and which tasks need job safety analysis, and where's the overlap and things like that. Another thing I wanted to point out is that when you have your operating procedure, the time and effort it takes to have the job safety analysis is minimal. Well, once you have the operating procedure, that's the hard part. Once you have that down, getting a job safety analysis done really isn't too much more effort to get that part taken care of as well, so you can have the safest operation you can have. So quickly, job safety analysis, according to the SEMS regs, is all activities in the SEMS program need a job safety analysis. They need to be readily accessible, just like your operating procedures. They need to identify the specific job tasks, the hazards associated with that task, and the control measures in place to prevent that hazard from occurring. Also, you need to have the person responsible to approve the job safety analysis prior to commencing work. You need to have specified both the person who is responsible exactly for certifying the job safety analysis, and obviously have that person certify the JSA before you get started. A job safety analysis essentially tries to bring the team together. It's what the main purpose of a job safety analysis is. It has the specific tasks is where you definitely start. And then usually the hardest part is getting all the tasks lined out one by one. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. And that's why I want to emphasize that once you have the operating procedure, simply bringing that stuff into a job safety analysis and then talking about the hazards isn't really that much more effort. The real effort comes with walking down the operating procedures with the operators to make sure those are indeed accurate. Once you have those accurate operating procedures, developing the JSA on top of that is really minimal effort. So they definitely should, once you have the steps, you need to at least have the personnel hazards, but you can also include environmental and equipment hazards as well. And I think that's a little bit more comprehensive of a job safety analysis, and I'll show some examples of that as well. Once you have the hazards, then you talk about the safety measures in place. These are all the things that we have in place to make sure that those hazards do not occur. And you need to have job safety analysis for both operations that is done by your facility personnel and also by the contractors. Same thing as your operating procedures. Tasks that are done by the contractors should have a JSA as well. Some of the benefits. The job safety analysis really, when you get that much experience talking about a certain task, it can really bring out new things about that task. You know, some things that perhaps weren't noticed before, or something that operator that has been doing this for so long can, you know, shed some light on it for the newer guys coming up. Whereas, you know, they would have, you know, had to done some trial and error to figure that stuff out before. Increases the general job knowledge as well as the safety culture. Once you get all those guys, and especially the operators, talking about the job and thinking about safety before they do the job, it really helps, you know, raise the job awareness as well as the job safety. And also it brings management and operations together. They have a chance to talk about a specific job instead of just a manager saying, you know, this needs to get done, and operations doing it. They need to come together and talk about that job specifically. So that's another good portion about a job safety analysis. The basic steps of a JSA. You need to, you know, basically once you get the job selected, you need to break it down into the steps. This is usually where the main portion of the effort is breaking the job down into the steps and the sequence of events. Identify the hazards and then determine the preventative measures you have in place. Here's an example of a simple JSA, and you know, once again on the left you start with the job steps, potential hazards, and then the safety things that are in place. Simply start with your operating procedure. Once you have your operating procedure, copy those things into the job steps straight away, and that'll get you started off on a great foot. You can bring this in front of the team, you can start going through the hazards, and you can really start moving with this and get this done. It's also important to note that on the JSA you need to have the supervisors, who it's approved by, and all those other things in there. Those are all important to a JSA. This is a little bit more comprehensive of a JSA. Basically, it includes tools and equipment hazards, environmental hazards as well. And I think that's pretty important. And again, not too much more effort to really making sure that when you're doing these operations, sometimes, you know, personnel hazards aren't as obvious, or I'm sorry, not obvious, but they aren't going to happen as often. Whereas equipment hazards can happen pretty easily. You know, no one will get hurt, which is, you know, the most important thing, but you still want to try to protect your compressors and things like that from getting damaged from, you know, one simple slip of a valve or, you know, something like that, operator not being able to respond quick enough. So these are the things that you can outline in JSA and sort of talk about before the task is started. And the main thing I wanted to highlight was that once you have your operating procedure, it's not too tough to get your JSA completed as well. So you know, what we're trying to spread is that all operations should have both operating procedure and a JSA is the type of culture that we want to start to nurture. And it's tough because, I mean, it's a lot of effort and whatnot, but we feel if people start heading in that direction, it's something that can pretty easily be accomplished. I also wanted to show some simple safety alerts related to operating procedures and JSAs. If you look for it on the MMS website, they list all these safety alerts and whatnot. JSAs are just prolific throughout all of them. You can definitely see how they really look for the JSAs for any task. These are the regulators, of course. They go straight to the JSA. Hey, was the JSA specific? Was the JSA done? All those things is exactly what they look for. And they're also looking a little bit more towards education as well, education of the operators. And once they get there, the next thing they look at are your operating procedures. How detailed are your operating procedures and things like that. In the second box there on the right, I bolded it. MMS found that a lack of written procedural guidelines for the performance of these routine tasks was a cause of each of the accidents. This is just a simple example of one of the things that MMS has found in the past, and this is in the Gulf of Mexico and whatnot. So they are looking, especially for JSAs, and they are starting to look more and more for written operating procedures that have the details of each task on them. I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to Steve to wrap things up. Thank you very much.
Good. Sound check okay? All right. Carlos, thank you very much. Okay, so what we've done is we've looked at background, accidents have occurred that have caused us to go down this path of developing an industrial and regulatory environment that looks at safety management systems issues and the safety and environmental management system specific requirements of 30 CFR Part 250, where those came from, and a lot of the key elements, a key one being operating procedures. Carlos has provided a lot of background in terms of tips for putting these together, what are the specific requirements, and mechanisms for doing it very efficiently. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to close things out by talking a little bit more about how to organize an effective program. One of the things that we need to keep in mind for offshore facilities is that there's a lot to do by the November 15th deadline that's specified by 30 CFR Part 250. The one nice thing is that the bulk of these safety management system elements are common to other loss prevention programs, such as process safety management and risk management programs. I provided you with a comparison chart. We talked about that overlap. The real good thing about that is that offshore facility companies that also operate onshore facilities have a lot of resources out there. They got technical resources, they got personnel resources, and mechanisms to effectively address these requirements. So let's talk about some tips on how to do this effectively. Recognizing that there's a broad spectrum of activities encompassed by safety and environmental management systems, you want to minimize duplication and integrate this as much as possible. One of the things we recommend for our clients, and when we're asked to support their SEMS programs, is to somehow unify them and work towards a unified program for those elements that make sense. Obviously, if you've got an onshore gas compression facility, it's going to have a lot of different requirements technically than an offshore facility. It's going to have different safety and environmental information, different operating procedures, different hazards associated with it. But a lot of key things, such as hot work permits, such as incident investigation activities, a lot of those are going to have mostly common elements. Integrating those and unifying the program as much as possible provides a lot of savings with respect to training, maintaining all the documentation in all these different programs. Also, when you're embarking upon a program as broad as SEMS, starting simple, weaving existing elements into new programs, doing a gap analysis. A lot of people, even though it's May 2011, a lot of people are starting with a gap analysis to identify what's the status of their program and what are the next steps to do and what are the most important things to do. As appropriate, you've got the existing elements, you've done your gap analysis, then you want to go ahead and update your existing program and really focus your energies as much as possible. One of the things I would like to also recommend with respect to the upcoming regulatory deadlines, these are broad programs, there's a lot of effort associated with this. Not waiting till the last minute would highly be recommended. Another thing that can help out a lot, and this dovetails with one of the things that Carlos did, which was showing you the SEMS solution approach to things, is there's a lot of unique challenges right now. Resources may be at locations remote to the offshore facility. resources with respect to personnel, resources with respect to specific information. You've got individuals that are responsible for these programs that are likely to be addressing SEMS at multiple facilities. And you've got operating company employees and contractors involved. And Michael Bromwich did make a speech at the OTC earlier this week about more intensive involvement and regulatory oversight over contractor activities. All these things, because it's all weaves together, it means that it's so important to share critical information with multiple locations, individuals, and companies. So these web-based software approaches, using your own company's intranet, and all these advanced communication applications can really go a long way towards making this broad program that's got a lot of elements much more manageable. During Carlos' discussion, he talked about operating procedure requirements, some examples of possible improvement areas that have come out of BP's findings associated with the Deepwater Horizon accident, and also how JSAs come into play. JSAs are kind of a unique requirement to offshore facilities that isn't directly emulated by process safety management and risk management programs, and it's specifically required as part of your hazards analysis task, and it forms a link in many cases between operating procedures and those hazards analyses. One of the things that's coming up on June 16th is we're going to be doing a webinar on a new software tool called ProSync that helps integrate those operating procedures and job safety analysis applications in a manner that's going to help offshore facilities address this in a much more manageable fashion. So there's a lot of tools out there. There's a lot of things available and a lot of good resources that you, as the operator of an offshore facility, has. Now, in terms of other resources, you've got your own internal resources. Obviously, there's consultants out there that can provide support, such as risk management professionals. What I wanted to do is also let you know that there's a lot of things available on the web. We're having this ongoing SEMS webinar series. In the package that was emailed to you last night, and also on this slide, are some of the recent elements of that webinar series that provide different tips on, for example, safety and environmental information application, hazards analysis. That was a real good one with a lot of different elements that can be helpful to you, and mechanical integrity programs, a key element of SEMS. All this is available to you. It's recorded. It's on our website. There's no cost to look at that and get some tips on how to implement these programs. And one of the things that I didn't do last night, but I will do, is send a copy of the technical paper that we put together for the Global Congress on Process Safety. That has a lot of good information on where these programs came from and a lot of the key elements that you need to look at. And I'll make sure everybody gets a copy of those, at least all the people who tune in and are participating in today's webinar. So what's coming up? Well, May 24th, our next installment of this, I guess it's in about 3 weeks, is looking at bow tie analyses. Bow tie analysis is a good mechanism for digesting key accident scenarios and putting it in a form that's very useful to management and highlights very highly hazardous accident scenarios. It's also it's a fairly new technique that's getting a lot of application and it should be very interesting. That's coming up. And also, if you look at our webpage, www.sems1.com, you'll see a lot of the other webinars in our SEMS series that are coming up. Other resources available to you. This is just in your package for your reference. There's a lot of information on the internet. The DOE MRE, obviously, there's a key source of regulatory requirements. And also our sems1.com page has a lot of background information and also upcoming offshore webinars. And it'll tell you how to get registered for those too. Also, the SEMS solution webpage can provide more information on that tool that Carlos overviewed. And also for your reference, we've just got some background information and key references for quality implementation of process safety programs in general. And I'm not going to go over all those. Those are provided for your reference, and you can go use them as you see fit. And obviously, I'd like to open it up for questions from the participants for this webinar. And also, you've got Carlos's email address and my email address. If there are any questions that come up or you'd like to bounce some ideas off of us or ask us some questions, happy to help out. And you're always also welcome to visit our sems1.com website for some more background information. So we have Carlos, and also Esther Brawley has slipped in to join us. And so we're all happy to take any questions that may come up from the audience. You can be unmuted, or you can pose a question on our chat window to our webcast producer.
How often are JSAs supposed to be performed?
All right, I'll let Carlos deal with that then. You're the JSA man.
All right, so the question was, how often are JSAs supposed to be performed? And there's no straight answer for that. Essentially, as often as necessary. And it needs to be done as long as it's accurate and the team knows exactly what needs to be done, then it should be adequate to have a JSA on file. If you have the same task performed by a different team, then that JSA needs to be redone for that team. And I would also say if there's new people involved in a team, you also need to bring out that JSA and go through it with the entire team as well, just so everyone is familiar with the tasks that are required.
There's a requirement to do these before November 15th too, right?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously everything for SEMS needs to be implemented before November 15th, but on a regular basis, they need to be done as long as everyone in the team is familiar with the same task and the JSA on file is accurate to exactly what's being done out there, then that's sufficient.
I was just going to reiterate that. Does it have to be on me? Okay. I was just going to reiterate what Carlos said. I mean, basically, for any written procedure that you have on file for your operations for that platform, every written procedure needs to have an accompanied JSA that's on file. It needs to be written, it needs to be complete, and probably using a format that Carlos brought up in his presentation. Now, if there's going to be differences in the way you're going to do that operation, examples from some of MMS's recommendations from before it became BOMER, when they were doing incident investigations, is even things like severe weather changes. If you're going to do the same operating procedure, but in maybe some really bad weather, you would need to pull the JSA, review it real quick with the team, update it as necessary, and then sign off on it. So it's very similar to doing a revalidation of a process hazard analysis for MOC purposes. It's just like doing a PHA. You do it one time, and as long as there hasn't been any major changes in the process, well, same thing. If the operating procedure hasn't changed, if the conditions you're operating it haven't changed, if key team members haven't changed, then you should be able to pull that JSA, look at it real quick, and say, yes, it's good. But there might be cases where you need to revise it, make revisions, and revalidate it.
Well, actually, let me ask you a question, and if you don't know the answer, then we'll get back to folks. There's a 3-year update requirement for the hazards analysis, and the JSA is part of the hazards analysis. So does that implicitly require them to be looked at every 3 years?
Yes, I would, other than the major milestones for a major reval.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. One of the things that I'll go ahead and reiterate here too is the JSA is part of your overall hazards analysis. There's a facility level hazards analysis, which is usually addressed with things like HAZOP studies or other techniques like that. There's a list of things that are acceptable in API recommended practice 75 and also 14J. And the JSA is another element that, as I mentioned before, is different from PSM and RMP in that it's focused more on tasks that operators are doing. Both the facility level hazards analysis and also JSAs are encompassed by this overall requirement for hazards analysis. The interesting timeline for the SEMS program is the hazards analysis that includes the JSA needs to be done, as Carlos said, before November 15th, 2011. 2 years after that is the first update, and then it's on a 3-year cycle after that. So if you did your first one by November 15th, 2011, and as Esther and Carlos are both saying, if nothing's changed, you don't have new teams, new situations, new procedures, new equipment, et cetera, then you'll want to revalidate that 2 years after that by November 15th, 2013, then 3-year cycles after that, November 15th, 2016, 2019, et cetera. Again, that all presupposes that there have been no changes that affect the conclusions of the JSA, such as new personnel, new equipment, or changes in procedural steps. And of course, you're going to want to have your training program emulate that too. Fair enough, guys? Okay, good. Do we have any other questions? Or hopefully that answered the question. All right. Since everybody's got contact points, I'd encourage you, if you do have other questions or issues that come up, please feel free to call us up, send us an email, and happy to help. One of the things that I like to see is when we get questions from folks that are trying to implement these programs, it usually keeps us on the top of our game and make sure that we fulfill our objective of providing the best quality support that we can to clients to make sure these SEMS programs are high level of quality and also very defensible in case there are many of the situation is going to be that there's going to be a lot of auditing that goes on of these programs by the various regulatory agency responsible for their implementation. So making a good quality, highly defensible program is very important. All right, thank you everybody, and we'll look forward to your participation on May 24th for our next webinar. Thank you. Okay, end transmission and end.